Ambassador Gary Grappo, great to see you again, and you're very kind to join us I sort of run out of adjectives. Just really, really momentous time, and a year when, as you know well, we've had an awful lot of momentous and paradigm shifting events in the Middle East. But we're talking, of course, about the events in Syria, and I want to ask you, just given your experience in the region and watching it for so long, did you ever think this day would come where you'd read this headline?
Well, the day was certainly going to come. I was just not certain I'd be around to see it. And I think what is most shocking to me is that for a very, very long time, many of us who were steeped in Syria lore, so to speak, in the State Department's Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs, had anticipated that the fall of the Assad regime would be an especially bloody one. Mm-hmm. And if you just speak of the most recent 11 or 12 days, I mean, certainly there was loss of life, but nothing on the level that we would have expected. Of course, this fall was preceded by 12, 13 years of very bloody, punishing, devastating civil war in that country.
Mm-hmm. What do you think accounts for that? Why? I mean, it's early days, of course, but and perhaps we'll eat these words, but for the first 24, 36 hours or so, as you point out, it hasn't looked that way. Why do you think that is?
Several factors. First of all, Assad was abandoned by his principal backers, Iran, Hezbollah, and Russian, for reasons we all know. Iran was too distracted by its own security, its vulnerability now having been brutally exposed by Israel. Russia, of course, very distracted by the war in Ukraine, which is demanding ever greater amounts of resources, not to mention troops. And Hezbollah, for a couple of reasons. Number one, they themselves have been devastated by Israel. But number two, Assad had anticipated, no doubt, that Hezbollah would come to his aid as they had back in 2012. Mm-hmm. But Syria did not come to Hezbollah's side when they were being pummeled by Israel.
Right.
And so what goes around comes around, and they decided to sit this one out. So the abandonment of its principal backers, leaving really a very shallow husk of a government and a very poorly led, poorly resourced, corrupt armed forces, which was almost entirely conscript. And so you really can't form a coherent, effective ruling authority under those circumstances. And they fell. Not surprising.
Right. Okay. Let's just cover a few things inside Syria at the moment. What can you tell us? There have been, I would say, not schools of thought, but different things written about Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is the group, HTS, the acronym, a coalition of rebel organizations. On the one hand, they certainly were at one time a jihadist group, links to al-Qaeda, I believe, fought Americans in Iraq and so forth. From what they have said since then, that they long ago broke not only ties with al-Qaeda, but changed their ideology to a more pragmatic one. How much do you know, and how much should we be worried or not, do you think, about that element of this?
I am concerned. It is true that Abu Muhammad al-Jolani appears to have taken a more pragmatic approach over the last 5 to 10 years during his leadership of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham up in the Idlib province, which is in northwest Syria, trying to dampen some of the more extremist elements of Islamism that they had previously followed under both the Islamic State as well as al-Qaeda. And some initial signs suggest that maybe he has followed up on that. He's issued warnings and announcements about respecting Christians, the Alawites, Kurds, etc. But the group that he leads, not only Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, but other groups that kind of fell under this large collection of rebels, were all united in their objective of removing the Bashar al-Assad regime. Well, they've done that. And what typically happens in circumstances like this, we've seen it before, is that the centrifugal forces driven by desires for power, for wealth, i.e. to claim their share of the spoils, creates these centrifugal forces and the basic elements of another civil war. Mm-hmm. And we've seen that, sadly, in the Balkans in the 90s. We've seen it in Afghanistan, Libya, Yemen, and Iraq. Mm-hmm. And this is why it's so important that the United States, most definitely moderate Arab countries, Turkey, and Israel, find a way to come together and reach out to the new leadership so far that we know of in Damascus. Mm-hmm. All of those countries have been handed an extraordinary opportunity thanks to Israel and Ukraine. As I said earlier, Iran and Russia have abandoned. They've pulled up stakes
because of Israel and Ukraine.
Yeah.
Yep.
And they pulled up stakes in Syria, and for the first time, there's an opportunity to move Syria into the camp of moderate Arab states, which is what we should strive for. I think it would be a little naive to try and foist a Jeffersonian democracy on a country that has absolutely no understanding, familiarity, or history with democracy. But certainly a country that fosters stability within the country as well as in the region. And that should be our objective.
Right. Before we get more to what the U.S. might or might not do, were you, again, surprised, heartened, something else by the rebels' first order of business, other than military, was to reach out to the prime minister in Syria? They seem to have a dialogue. We're hearing words like transition government, maybe elections. Again, these aren't what you typically would think of for an organization that at one point espoused, the creation of a caliphate in the region, right?
Exactly. And so these are the first really encouraging signs that they may indeed get it, that there's no future in an Islamist caliphate. That imposes an extreme version of Islam on a population that is very disparate, multi-confessional, and has different views about what their country should be. Trying to promote a caliphate, and I don't think I've heard anyone make that claim, but it would just create certain conditions for civil war. So those are really positive signs. And the rest of the world, and most especially, as I said before, Turkey, Israel, moderate Arab states, United States, Europeans, should be encouraging and promoting that. Moreover, Tom, I think we have the possibility to incentivize a new leadership in Damascus. The various estimates for needed humanitarian aid and investment to rebuild a very, very devastated country are on the order of $200 billion. If there's going to be any chance of attracting that kind of investment and support, these countries are the ones who can do it. And they should lay down some pretty clear conditions on what they expect in terms of governance inside Syria and its external behavior.
Mm-hmm. Now, back to then the U.S. and to use your phrase, what they can do with this extraordinary opportunity it is complicated, at least in the short term, right, by the fact that HTS still is on the State Department terrorism list. So, I mean, how does one go about? You've were a diplomat in the region for so long. How does one go about uh, beginning the process of? I'm sure we're talking to them in some way at the moment, but taking advantage of that opportunity. What are some of the things you think need to happen?
Well, and this is an area where I'm not extremely familiar, but most definitely the United States and certainly other countries have ways of reaching out to Jelani and perhaps others to start moving in the right direction. Turkey most definitely does. Turkey probably has the most influence of HTS at the moment. And we should be talking to the Turks. We all have a shared interest in seeing stability within Syria. There are other armed factions that were not part of this movement. There are the Syrian Democratic Forces, principally the Kurds up in the northwest. There is the Syrian National Army, which is basically a militia group that's armed and backed by Turkey, which controls areas along the northern border with Turkey. And then we have smaller militia groups down in the south that have been supported by Jordan. They were the ones, I believe, who captured Dada near the Jordanian border. So we're going to have to start reaching out to these countries that have that kind of influence and start encouraging all of them to move in a shared direction. And that's going to be hard. Mounting a war against a dictator like Assad and uniting forces behind that is comparatively easy
Mm-hmm.
with forming a government. So now is the hard part. And now is when the countries that I've been mentioning need to come together to help promote, encourage positive movement here. Because we're at a dangerous point. I mean, this could break down into a civil war that would be in no one's interest. And moreover, it would create conditions for the return of players we really don't want to see, i.e., Hezbollah, Iran, Russia, and perhaps the Islamic State, which I should also mention remains in Syria in various pockets in the central and eastern desert.
Right. I mean, all of this and the power vacuum, everything else surface when the iron fist goes away, right?
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely.
So what is so that's the bad side of the ledger looking forward. Back to your extraordinary opportunity, Ambassador Grappo. I'm curious because it is this whole. It's quite dizzying to think about Syria. Yes, not a Jeffersonian democracy, maybe, but is there? What's a somewhat realistic hope one can have for the kind of government that might? I mean, are we talking about a sort of Egyptian style? I'll leave you to answer, but what's a, a good outcome that you think is reasonable to hope for at this point?
Well, I've heard and read reports that Ajulani, the head of HTS, is a great admirer of Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia, and ignoring for the moment some of the egregious missteps of MBS during the initial period after he was named Crown Prince. He's done some really remarkable things in Saudi Arabia, and those are really undeniable, both on the social reform side as well as the economic side. Of course, not much at all on the political side. I'm not necessarily saying that he should follow in the footsteps of MBS, but certainly picking up on some of the things that MBS has done to genuinely improve the lot of Saudis, and in this case, Syrians. I don't know if there's an ideal model because we don't have any democracies, and it's hard to point to a non-democracy as a
Right,
model.
right.
But what I'm looking for is someone who tamps down extremism inside the country, who is able to form a leadership that brings these various groups, particularly the arms groups, together willingly in order to form some form of government, even if it may not be democratic, And with that stability, they can begin to attract the kind of humanitarian aid and most definitely investment they need to rebuild the country. And that's going to create then stability in a country that's often been referred to as the fulcrum of the Middle East.
Right.
It just connects with everywhere.
Yeah.
Iraq, Lebanon, Israel, Jordan, and not too far away, countries like Saudi Arabia and certainly Iran. And with that, joining, as I mentioned earlier, this fold of moderate Arab states, we might be able to create the kind of stability in the region I don't know that we've ever seen.
Yeah.
And from that, good things can then follow. Now that's the rose-colored lenses view. It's not impossible, but it also will require a concerted effort on these countries to reach out to whatever leadership in Syria emerges to promote movement in that direction. And I think the U.S. most definitely needs to be a part and a key part of that.
Yeah. So last question then, to put on your, or look in your crystal ball, because you've outlined, as you said, a rose-colored view and then just outright civil war. What do you think is the more likely outcome right now?
At this initial stage, it's very, very hard to see how things are going to play out tomorrow, much less next week, next month, and the ensuing months. I think Adjulani will certainly have his hands full in trying to get some of these other groups to not necessarily lay down their arms, but stop fighting one another. I'm also concerned about remnants of the Syrian army still having access to weapons, much like we confronted in Iraq when we disbanded the Iraqi army, and they ended up forming their own terrorist organization that was a nemesis of ours for years. That could easily happen in Syria as well. And then finally, I'm worried about Turkey and, to a lesser extent, but also Israel, maybe perhaps trying to take advantage in the border areas. We've seen Israel do some things. I mean, clearly it was in their security interest to take those measures. They're now temporarily occupying Syrian land they've never claimed before, to the east of the Golan Heights.
Right.
And that may be understandable during this uncertain period, but at some point they need to make clear that they are going to withdraw.
Right.
And similarly, the Turks have to make clear that they have no claim on Syrian territory. And then a really hard lift for Turkey is finding a way to work with the Kurds of Turkey.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. It's a great sweep. Gary Grappo, thanks for being with us. And here's to the more rose-colored version coming to pass. I appreciate it.
Let's hope for rosy 2025.
Yes. Thanks again. Appreciate it.
Sure.